Throwaway because some of the people in this story still think they own my life. I didn't grow up with the usual suburban glow-up narrative where your parents tuck you in and tell you they're proud. My parents were the kind of people who ran a tight household like it was a drill team. Posture, tone, obedience. Praise was conditional, and affection came with footnotes. So when I say they locked me out during a blizzard, it's not an exaggeration. It's one of those moments that rewired my trust for good. I was 15. It was late December and a storm had been rolling in all evening. Sleet first, then a wind that sounded like someone dragging chains across the roof. My sister, 3 years older, had promised she'd be home by 9 because she had a study group. She waltzed in at midnight with a boy and the car doors slammed like an announcement. I was on the couch, halfway through algebra, laptop balanced on my knees because the heater in my room had a habit of giving up on cold nights. I stood when my parents told me to and said goodnight when they said goodnight, but I forgot the ritual. I forgot to go to their bedroom and verbally say the exact phrase they liked, "Good night, Ma," and "Good night, Pa," in the cadence they expected. It sounds petty because it was petty. They made it petty. Discipline builds character, Dad always said. The phrase stuck to him like cologne. That night, it meant walking me outside into the storm and locking the door. They watched me with the same clinical calm I'd seen in the vet once, like they were observing something that was a necessary procedure. Mom actually shut the door with a click that echoed. I pounded. I shouted until my voice blurred into the wind. I banged on the glass, raised the neighbor's curtains, tried the back door. The driveway was a white wall in front of me, and each step felt like pushing against an ocean. Hours. I don't say that lightly. Hours where the cold took its pieces. Numbness crawls up in the parts you don't expect. Your fingertips, the edges of your ears, the soft skin between your knuckles. I remember the sound of my breath and the way my thoughts went funny, like someone had messed with the color on a TV screen. At some point, my hands stopped obeying me. I remember thinking about the oven, about the warm metal of a handle, ridiculous survival math that teens come up with when they're too cold to think straight. When someone finally let me in, I don't even know who turned the key. Later, Mom said she felt bad and opened the door. My hands were gray at the tips. They sent me to the ER because that was the adult move to make when your actual adults have frozen you. At the hospital, my fingers looked like a bad art project, blackened, blistered. The resident used words like frostbite and tissue damage and said things I didn't want to hear. I thought they'd look at me then. I expected the parents in every after-school special, regret, a flurry of apologies. We didn't mean it. Maybe an awkward attempt at caring. Instead, Dad's voice was low and flat, the kind of whisper you use so nobody else has to hear your confession. "Good," he said. "Maybe now you'll stop touching things you don't deserve." It wasn't just the words, it was the casual cruelty. The way he framed my pain as a correction. They posted a family selfie the next morning, the same profile picture they'd used for months. Cozy blanket, warm smiles, their perfect faces. Caption, "Cozy night in with our perfect kids." They tagged my sister, of course. They didn't tag me. I sat on the couch with my thumb in a bowl of iced chips and scrolled to that post like it was a physical stab. My sister commented with some passive, "Love you guys," gif. Nobody messaged me privately to ask if I was okay. That moment, hearing the world treat your suffering like a punctuation mark, is an ignition point. I swore. Then, in the antiseptic brightness of that hospital room, a small, cold prayer. If they wanted to freeze me out, I'd become the kind of person who could set their lives to ice and watch the melt take what it needed. Not out of fantasy, out of slow, deliberate planning. Not a movie explosion, but something surgical and unmissable. For years after, I wore the memory like armor. People assume revenge is a hot-blooded thing, a gas station fire. For me, it was the opposite, meticulous and patient. I learned to read the small things that made my parents comfortable, the like buttons they hit online, the charities they faked interest in, the HOA networks they belonged to. I learned how they operated. Reputation mattered. Appearances mattered more than truth. I got better at being invisible in the house and hypervisible on the internet. I went quiet in the real world and loud where it counted. High school ended, and so did the immediate power they had over my day-to-day decisions. I left for college with my hands scarred, but my head full of other plans. I studied hard because competence is a slow kind of revenge. It doesn't need fireworks. It needs resumes, references, internships that turn into jobs, and then into leverage. While they were curating the glossy life for the world, I built a life that would not need their approval to exist. I also kept a ledger, not numbers or receipts, but details. How my dad loved being on boards because it looked good on the business card. How mom volunteered but always left before the hard work started. Names, places, petty liabilities that would, if aligned right, mean something later. This isn't me declaring war. You should know I'm not about violent ends or nonsense. I'm a man who learned that power can be boring. A bank account, a voice that other people listen to, the ability to make choices that change the landscape of the people around you. I wanted them to feel the drop in temperature not as physical pain, but as practical consequence. I wanted their world to look the same picture-perfect way it always had, and for the world to notice the cracks. Now I'm 27. I still remember the smell of the hospital antiseptic. I still see their family selfie in my head. And I still have that cold promise folded somewhere safe, like an unspent currency. This is the start of how I move from being the frozen kid on the porch to someone who can, quietly and efficiently, unthaw their facade. Part of me wants them to understand why I did it. Another part wants them to never know that their son built a life that could make them uncomfortable for once. Either way, I'm done giving them the benefit of rhetorical doubt. They taught me how to be a ghost in my own home. Now I'll teach them how it feels to have their warmth questioned. I left with the minimum that still felt like ownership: a duffel bag, a laptop that could limp through spreadsheets, and a quiet certainty that I would not be the same person who stood on that porch. The first few months were scramble mode: classes, shifts at a coffee shop that smelled like burnt beans at 5 a.m., and an apartment that held more boxes than furniture. I learned quickly that independence is paperwork and small emergencies: setting up a bank account, scheduling car repairs, learning how to call a landlord without sounding like you were about to cry. Those are the little competencies my parents never taught me, because those were the moments they judged as toughening up, not abandoning. College was more than textbooks. It was the quiet observation lab where I studied people like I used to study my parents. I watched how social currency worked. Not the high drama of parties, but the slow accrual of favor. A professor remembering your name, a TA forwarding your resume, a senior inviting you to a project because they trusted you to not flake. I did internships that paid in coffee and future clout. I slept less and answered emails at odd hours because my rage needed a job title: ambition. I also learned to be strategic. Revenge in the real world doesn't look like movies. It's not about theatrics, it's about leverage. I treated leverage like a portfolio: diversify, build financial stability so I couldn't be gaslit into poverty, build social capital so my words would land somewhere, build competence so I could walk into rooms where decisions happened. The first thing I invested in was myself: therapy, a bank account with a decent emergency fund, and a mentor who didn't conflate grit with self-destruction. It was the practical revenge: become unbreakable in the ways that matter. Work brought its own curriculum. I started in an entry-level analysis role at a small nonprofit, the kind of place that promises mission and pays in modest dignity. I volunteered for the tasks nobody wanted: grant reports, budget reconciliations, community outreach that meant sitting in uncomfortable rooms and listening. It taught me to see the levers people use to influence perception: who got quoted in press releases, who got seats at tables, who got invited to speak at fundraisers. Reputation, I learned, was a product that could be manufactured slowly, ethically, and often through other people's work. Around year 3 out of college, I stopped being invisible. It wasn't dramatic, it was incremental. A senior at work recommended me for a city planning task force. I said yes and learned how to network without being gross about it. I curated a professional presence that was sharp, LinkedIn posts that were thoughtful, not performative, panels where I spoke plainly, not for applause. My parents' image of me as the kid who needed to be corrected started to clash with the new outlines people drew of me: competent, calm, reliable. But I didn't rush the personal stuff. The ledger I kept in my head, the names, the little humiliations, wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. It was a map. I cataloged which bank Dad used for vanity accounts tied to charity donations, which boards he sat on, old money networks where favors are currency, and Mom's social circles, church groups, neighborhood committees, the charity photo ops where she loved the camera. Small things, but the kind of details that make a life brittle if pressure is applied in the right place. I started to test the architecture. Not maliciously, but experimentally. I used a throwaway channel to post a small, factual expose about the local charity my mom lip-synced for. Nothing illegal, just the kind of transparency piece that asked questions about overhead and impact. It rippled quietly. One donor asked a question at a board meeting. Someone actually followed up. Nobody named my mom, but she bristled when the neighborhood WhatsApp group lit up. I saw how a single well-placed fact could unsettle a curated image. That was the pattern I was after. Financial leverage, however, felt cleanest. I picked a career in urban economics because it married my knack for analysis with a field where influence mattered. It paid better than nonprofits. I moved from analyst to associate to a mid-tier firm that advised municipalities and development boards. With that came connections to people my parents had always wanted to know, not because they were better, but because they were relevant. I made a small fortune in reputation capital, then translated it into actual capital. I paid off debt, built investments, and learned how the lending world worked. The exact mechanics of mortgages and liens that could complicate a condo listing or make a donor think twice before writing a check. Alongside that, my social strategy evolved. I learned to be patient with humiliation. The smartest move I made was not to confront them publicly, but to become the kind of person whose absence left a cool gap in their narrative. I stopped RSVPing to family events. I let their social feed tell its curated story without me. The silence did something stranger than anger. It pulled people's gaze away from my absence and toward the polished illusion they preferred. That made them complacent, which was useful. But complacency can be weaponized only if you're willing to be strategic and ethical at once. There were rules I set for myself early on. No illegal moves, no public smear campaigns, no attempts to ruin someone's livelihood with lies. I wanted consequences grounded in truth and structure. If they were going to feel cold, I wanted it to be because the scaffolding they'd built their life on had been altered by honest exposure and by me occupying places they could not. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake, but consequences for sustained negligence. By year 6, the plan had a spine. I'd cultivated a small portfolio, an advisory role on a nonprofit they cared about, a seat on a community development board where their HOA opinions had weight, and a few well-placed friendships with journalists and city officials. I wasn't powerful in the blockbuster sense. No yachts, no revenge movie budget. But I had the means to make the things they relied on more difficult to fake. If their image needed perfect weather, I could become the storm that produced the first real weather report. In quieter moments, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not to make them suffer like I had. That would be petty, but to correct the narrative where their cruelty had been glossed over by smiles and captions. I wanted them to be accountable in public ways they cared about. Boards noticing inconsistencies in reports, donors claiming their attention elsewhere, neighbors asking pointed questions at PDA meetings. The goal was alignment. Let their private cruelty and their public persona meet, honestly and without theatrics. People coached me toward forgiveness as the heroic arc. Maybe it is. But forgiveness felt like a final chapter one couldn't write until the book had an honest spine. First, people needed to see that my life didn't end at that locked door. Then, maybe, conversation could happen. Or maybe not. Either outcome felt acceptable. What mattered was that I stopped orbiting their judgment. So I built. Quietly. Methodically. With cold patience. And somewhere between the grants I wrote, the city meetings I chaired, and the bank accounts I balanced, I began to feel something like power. Not the blinding kind that burns everything in sight, but the steady kind that freezes and preserves. The plan wasn't completed yet. Part of the craft was timing. For now, I waited like a person who knows frost will come if you let the night do its work. They throw parties to prove everything's fine. That's what I learned watching my parents. When a life is held together by appearances, celebrations are a firewall. So when the annual gala for Dad's nonprofit rolled around, chandeliers, open bar, the same smiling donors in identical tuxes, I knew it would be the perfect place to start making people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't ignore. I didn't crash the party with a megaphone. I don't do noise. I do leverage. My partner's startup had just finished a small but sharp audit on local community charities. It wasn't dramatic on its own. A handful of accounting irregularities here, vague program outcomes there, a few governance lapses. But at scale, those things matter. Money is a language. Donors start asking questions when they suspect the grammar is sloppy. We published the report online under the startup's name. I stayed off the byline. It wasn't about ego, it was about the effect. The report was clean, sourced, and more important, it asked practical questions donors could verify themselves. Within 48 hours, a local investigative reporter picked it up. He called me, not because he knew me, but because the report was the kind that makes editors lean in. We talked over coffee in a diner where nobody knew either of us. I answered questions carefully, framed things as concern for donor outcomes, and when he asked if I knew anything specific about Dad's nonprofit, I said the quietest thing: only what's public. But the public deserves clarity. That small sentence did more damage than 3 angry speeches. Reporters have beat rhythms. Once a beat is hot, they follow. The paper ran a piece that framed the audit as part of a larger trend. They quoted the report, quoted independent analysts, and, most efficiently, quoted donors who said they wanted answers. Social media did the rest. People who give for image will sometimes stop giving when the image can't be trusted. Dad called me that night. I let it go to voicemail. His message was thinly controlled panic. Can you explain this? They've been calling the office, the board. His voice broke on the last syllable in a way I hadn't heard in years. There was no apology. Panic is not remorse. I listened and let the message sit like ice in a glass. The first tangible crack was procedural. The board demanded an emergency meeting. In the public statements they crafted together, words like transparency and cooperation glittered. In private, they strategized how to keep donors from pulling checks. I watched the board's emails, the one place where people who think they're safe like to plan defenses. That access came through allies I'd collected, grad students, interns, people who needed internships and are happy to trade access for a line on their resume. I didn't hack anything. I curated relationships until doors opened. It turns out power loves to be helpful to someone who seems useful. My sister's reaction was the strangest slice of the whole thing. She texted me, 6 words, "What did you do?" There was a funny, childish tone to it, like she was daring me to fall off the curb. I didn't reply. How do you explain to someone that you didn't have the option of not doing this? That the frostbite is still a map on the inside of your hands, and that every time they post a family selfie you drown for a second? She had always been invested in optics. This was bigger than her ability to look good. The board meeting played out in the kinds of boring, petty ways power always does. They formed a committee. They promised an internal review. They drafted a PR statement emphasizing commitment to best practices. But a few donors, uncomfortable with uncertainty, did the kind of quiet thing that hurts organizations more than headlines. They froze donations until the questions were answered. The nonprofit's cash flow creaked. The executive director, a man who'd been mostly a smiling presence at events, was suddenly fielding real calls from board chairs who were more interested in spreadsheets than photo ops. Mom began doing the slow distance panic that middle-aged people do when social currency is threatened. More brunches, more calls to friends, more nervous smiles. She called me once and asked if I could help smooth things. The language was transparent. Do damage control, be their ghost fixer. I didn't answer that call either. I watched instead as a woman who'd never known a crisis she couldn't pose at slowly learned how ugly real questions look in public. There were smaller, meaner moments I didn't plan, but that landed because I'd nudged the tectonic plates. A volunteer who'd been complicit in glossing over numbers resigned publicly with a letter that read like a punctuation mark. It thanked the organization for the experience and urged them to take transparency seriously. The resignation made the paper. People who'd once liked my parents for the pictures started to ask louder questions. The board chair, a man who once told my father he was a model of civic virtue at a Rotary Club luncheon, quietly stepped down. It was the sort of domino that feels personal to watch. The public peeling away from them was more humiliating than any private rebuke could be. Watching it all wasn't satisfying in the way I'd imagined when I was younger. The glow of victory wasn't cinematic. It was small, dry, and often lonely. There were nights I sat in my apartment looking at my bank account, the slow, boring thing that had helped bring this about, and felt a hollow ache. My partner would fall asleep next to me, and I'd wake up in the middle of the night with the taste of salt and bleach, the memory of the ER antiseptic. Sometimes I wondered if I'd become my father in the way I moved through rooms, careful, calculating, unwilling to show the mess. But there were also moments that felt like justice, measured and almost tender. A donor called the nonprofit asking for an itemized ledger of how program funds were spent. Another invited the board to a public Q&A. Accountability is an ugly mirror for people used to flattering angles. They hated it. I was not blind to that hatred. Sometimes it came through in private messages from mutual acquaintances, the ones surprised that I could do this. They used words like ruthless and brilliant in the same sentence. I let them have both adjectives. Call it what you want. I called it a cold, necessary correction. My sister texted again the day after the chair resigned. This time, we need to talk. The message was simple, tremulous, and oddly human. I felt the old reflex to soften, to reach for explanations that might bridge us. But explanations don't undo what was done. They don't warm frostbitten fingers. So I showed up at her apartment that evening, not to argue, but to witness. She opened the door, her face thinner than the pictures, eyes rimmed with the kind of tired that comes from holding two contradictory truths, loyalty to parents and the creeping embarrassment of their unraveling. We sat in silence for a long time. She asked, eventually, what I wanted. I told her, without theatrics, that I wanted the truth to matter. Not as revenge for the sake of spectacle, but because if you keep covering the cracks, eventually a house falls in. She cried then, a soft, private thing I'd never seen from her. Not for the organizations, not even for dad or mom, but for something smaller, for the version of our family that had existed in pictures, the one that never unclipped its smile. Her grief was a shock. It complicated the ledger in a way I hadn't expected. Family is not a problem set. It's a series of messy attachments and half-finished apologies. I left her apartment with no feeling of triumph. The board chair had gone. Donations had slowed. My parents were scrambling. The world was finally asking the questions I had been whispering for years. It wasn't vindictive, not really. It was corrective. But correction has costs, and I was beginning to understand one of them. You can't aim coldness at a system without sometimes chilling the people you love. That night, I held my scarred hands under warm water longer than necessary, watching the pink come back like a promise. The ledger was growing. The world I'd built to make them uncomfortable was functioning. But as the edges of my fingers warmed, I felt the irony. That warmth could be its own kind of danger. When you pull a thread in a family that's built on appearances, you don't just unravel fabric. You hear the sound of stitches breaking in every direction. By the time the nonprofit story hit its second wave of coverage, things weren't just uncomfortable for my parents. They were bleeding reputation in slow, ugly drips. And for people like them, that's worse than money. The paper ran a follow-up piece. It wasn't just about the nonprofit anymore. It framed the issue as a culture of oversight failures in mid-sized community charities. The journalist, the same one I'd had coffee with months earlier, had gone deeper. He interviewed former employees, volunteers, even a few minor donors who felt they'd been misled. There weren't illegal fireworks, no embezzlement, no smoking gun, but there was rot. Inflated outcome numbers, misreported expenses, nepotism on the board. It wasn't a scandal you could meme into oblivion. It was worse. It was boring, credible, and hard to argue with. My dad tried to front it out. He went on local radio, voice calm and lawyered, insisting this was a moment for growth and that the nonprofit was already taking steps to improve transparency. But I could hear the shake in his breath between words. My mom did her part by posting family photos with captions about sticking together through storms. They looked like people trying to sell umbrellas in the middle of a hurricane. Meanwhile, donors started making the quiet moves that don't trend online but decide fates. They redirected checks to other charities. They told friends they were waiting to see how things played out. The nonprofit wasn't broke yet, but cracks were visible. Event attendance dipped. Board members who'd loved the spotlight now ducked interviews. I kept playing the long game. I didn't want this to be a single wave that they could ride out. I wanted it to be a season of winter, a sustained freeze. So I began the next phase, tightening the circle of pressure. Remember the startup I'd helped a friend launch? The transparency platform? We'd been building momentum. After the local press coverage, a regional foundation reached out asking if we could do a workshop on nonprofit accountability. My friend asked me to lead part of it, since I knew the mechanics. I said yes. I stood in front of 50 nonprofit execs, half of whom probably didn't know me, and explained best practices, itemized budgets, independent audits, separating family from governance. The irony didn't escape me, teaching the exact lessons my parents had dodged for years. After the workshop, I shook hands, swapped cards, made connections. A few of those connections overlapped with donors my parents used to brag about. Reputation is a small town in the end, even in big cities. Word travels. By the time I left that conference, I'd planted seeds that would make it harder for my parents' nonprofit to scrub its image. Every donor who now had best practice language in their vocabulary was a donor harder to fool. At home, though, things got messy in ways I hadn't fully braced for. My sister kept reaching out. First short texts, then longer ones. She wanted to meet again. She wasn't naive. She knew I'd had a hand in what was happening, even if she couldn't trace the fingerprints. She was caught in the middle, trying to defend parents who had treated me like an unwanted tenant, but who had also, in her mind, given her stability. It wasn't simple for her. When we met the second time, she said something that cut sharper than Dad's whisper in the hospital ever had. "You're becoming him," she told me. Her voice wasn't angry, just tired. Calculating, controlling, pulling strings. You just aim it outward instead of inward. I wanted to argue. To tell her there's a difference between cruelty for sport and accountability for harm. But I could see the fatigue in her face. She wasn't wrong about the calculation part. I'd been building my revenge like an architect drafts blueprints. Precise, unemotional, structural. And maybe to her, from the outside, that looked like Dad's control dressed up in different clothes. We sat in silence after that. She cried again, and I didn't have the right words. I realized in that moment that revenge doesn't just cut your enemies. It can carve scars into the people standing closest to you. Still, I couldn't stop. Not yet. The next domino fell at the state level. Someone, maybe the journalist, maybe a rival nonprofit, filed a complaint with the Attorney General's Charity Bureau. It wasn't criminal, but it triggered a review. Suddenly, my parents weren't just dealing with reporters and donors. They were dealing with regulators. The letter, I heard later, arrived on a Tuesday. My mom called my sister in tears, saying she felt betrayed by people who didn't understand how much work we do. My dad got quieter. He started skipping events. The man who once thrived on being the loudest voice in the room was suddenly a ghost in his own house. Friends of theirs started keeping their distance. You could see it on social media. Fewer tags, fewer brunch selfies, more silence. In a world built on curated images, silence is lethal. I didn't post about it. I didn't gloat. I just watched. Sometimes in the quiet of my apartment, I'd scroll through their profiles, remembering the night of the blizzard, the family selfie that excluded me, the caption about perfect kids. It felt like the ice was finally spreading outward, touching them the way it had touched me. And yet, victory tasted weird. It wasn't joy. It was something colder, emptier. Like drinking water when you expected wine. My partner asked me one night, "What's the end game? How do you know when you've done enough?" I didn't have an answer. That scared me. Because the truth was, I'd been chasing this for so long. This idea of turning their world to ice, that I hadn't thought much about what warmth could look like after. I'd imagined the unraveling, but not the rebuilding. Still, I pressed on. Because even if the revenge felt hollow, the justice felt necessary. They'd locked me out in a storm and called it discipline. They'd laughed off frostbite as drama. They'd whispered that I didn't deserve to touch things. For that, the world needed to see who they really were when the camera wasn't flashing. And the world was beginning to see. But the deeper I went, the more I realized. Exposure was just the beginning. If I wanted the freeze to last, I'd have to push them past reputation into something even colder, isolation. That would be part 5. And it scared me, because I wasn't sure who I'd be on the other side of it. There's a particular silence that follows when your life's scaffolding is quietly removed. It isn't dramatic. No smashed windows, no dramatic confrontations, just a few fewer phone calls, fewer invitations, a calendar that starts to look suspiciously empty. For my parents, that silence was the final winter. For me, it was the part where you learn the cost of handing someone the thermostat. After the state review, a handful of key donors officially cut ties. The board shuffled like a deck that had been washed in a storm. The executive director resigned with a smooth statement about personal reasons, and the nonprofit announced an independent audit that, ironically, confirmed a lot of the questions people had whispered about. The PR machine chugged, but some machines can't run without fuel. The fundraisers had fewer guests. The gala that used to be a social trampoline became a place people avoided. My parents stopped being fixtures and started being footnotes. That achieved, I felt the expected relief for about 3 days. Then came the unexpected hollow. People measure their lives in different currencies. My parents accumulated social capital and curated friendships. I'd been stockpiling influence, accounts, and leverage. Neither of those things warms you on a cold night. My sister and I didn't fix everything by talking. We didn't have some cinematic reconciliation where we hugged and all the ghosts vanished. What we had was honesty, brutal, clumsy, and human. She told me that watching our parents lose their stage made her feel unmoored. She'd built a small life that relied on their facade. Losing that stage forced her to consider what was left underneath. She confessed she'd always been terrified of being wrong about them, terrified of seeing them as anything less than perfect. I wanted the world to be the same picture I had, she said, voice small. I didn't think about what that picture cost you. That admission mattered more than an apology. It didn't erase the past, but it shifted the ledger from black and white to something that looked like a person. She asked, eventually, not for forgiveness, that felt performative, but for a chance to be in the same room without pretending. I said yes, because refusing would have been another way of letting the cold win. The hardest thing was watching my parents. They didn't become villains in an instant. They became people with less applause. There was a grace to their shrinking world that I admit surprised me. Dad stopped going to every civic event he could. He started reading thick books about birds, something he'd joked about in the past, but never had time for. Mom took up cooking classes and would send small photos of complicated sauces, captioned with notes about texture. They were smaller, human-sized things that made me feel, in a way I hadn't expected, a flicker of sadness. I'm not saying I softened. There was no sudden maternal epiphany, no "you were right" text with emoticons. My father never said the word sorry in a way that mattered. But the posture of my life shifted. The ledger I'd kept had been useful, surgical, effective. It had taught me the power of patience and planning. It had also taught me that winning has a shape, and sometimes that shape is lonely. I thought often about the hospital smell, the bleach, the antiseptic, and the whisper of my father's "good." That night had been the origin story I returned to like a map. But a map is only useful if you remember how to read the terrain beyond the point you marked. I'd planned the freeze so well I hadn't mapped the thaw. There were small ironies. A former donor who'd once RSVP'd to every event called me one afternoon, not to gloat, but to ask advice about nonprofits and how to choose one that actually did good. We spoke for an hour. He said, plainly, he regretted the assumptions he'd made about charity because the glossy photos had felt like proof enough. He thanked me for making him care enough to look. That was a rare, clean moment. It felt like justice that educated someone instead of humiliating them. But there were also moments I didn't account for. A childhood friend reached out and told me, hesitantly, that our neighborhood's HOA board was now asking questions about my parents' old project with them. Another acquaintance asked me to consult on a transparency initiative for their foundation. These ripple effects made me the person who could carve light into small corners of systems I'd once ignored. There's a strange satisfaction in that. Less personal, more architectural. It started to feel less like revenge and more like a career path I'd accidentally built. Even so, the personal cost bled into my life. My partner confronted me one night after I'd spent an entire weekend drafting an op-ed about nonprofit accountability. "When is enough really enough?" she asked. She didn't sound angry so much as exhausted on my behalf. She wanted the person she loved back, not the ledger I kept or the strategist I'd become. She wanted someone who remembered how to be present without calculating impact. I realized then that I'd used my relationship as a lab for strategies, testing leverage and influence like variables. I had to choose. Keep optimizing or stop and live with the messy, vulnerable stuff. I chose vulnerability, not because it was noble, but because the alternative felt like becoming the thing I hated. I started saying no to certain projects. I took a week off and did little things that felt dangerously non-strategic. Cooking dinner with my partner, going for a hike where my phone had no signal, letting my face get cold in the wind without measuring the moment. It was small, clumsy therapy, but it worked. Closure, if it can be called that, didn't look like a courtroom scene. It looked like a family dinner where plates were passed without comment. It looked like a conversation where my father asked, quietly, about my job and listened when I answered. It looked like a room where my mother put down a fork and said, "I don't know how to fix what I did, but I want to try." Those words were not absolution. They were, at best, a beginning of something neither of us had rehearsed for. A few months later, my sister texted a photo of a family album page she'd found, an old, grainy picture of us building a snowman in a backyard that wasn't picturesque so much as real. "Do you remember this?" she wrote. Underneath, she added, "We were kids once." I stared at the photo for a long time, the snowman crooked and cheerful, and felt the strange chemistry of thaw beginning. I don't pretend everything is fixed. The nonprofit is in a different place now, with new governance and a board that actually reads its bylaws. My parents still have fewer invites. Some friendships never returned. But the stinging blackness of my fingers is a memory that taught me I could survive pain and plan for consequence. It also taught me that survival should not be the only metric by which we measure a life. If there's a moral, it's messy. You can make someone uncomfortable and call it corrective. You can watch reputations recalibrate and feel a grim satisfaction. You can become a force for accountability and still lose small things you loved along the way. I wanted, for a long time, to turn their world to ice. I did. The ice did its work. But then the question became inevitable. What do you do after the ice? I'm learning that the answer isn't a single move. It's the daily, unglamorous work of choosing warmth even when you remember the cold.